Okay, so thank you again. Let's start as previously with setting our motivation. And again, what I really want to do is to do our best to do it from the heart. So we might find it hard to imagine ourselves being Buddhas or the journey to Buddhahood. We might find it hard to imagine being liberated from all suffering, from samsara. But we can be sure that we want to be better people, and we want to do our best for everybody in the universe anyway. And so at the very least, let's try to develop that sort of motivation. If we do have faith and ability to imagine ourselves as Buddhas, then definitely that's the best, right? So so what I'm saying is I take refuge in the Dharma, Buddha Dharma, the Buddha and the Sangha, the community, and the purpose of that refuge is such that I might, through teaching and through listening and through the other perfections, achieve enlightenment, Buddhahood, so that I might benefit all sentient beings. Okay, thank you very much. So I want to first of all apologize slightly about two things. One of them really was to do with the pace of last week, and secondly, almost incoherence towards the end, and I am to blame. At least two people said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get it. And it's like, no, my responsibility is to try to make this clear. Yes, you do your best to listen, but certainly if there are more than one person pointing this out to me, I think the mistake is over here. Okay, so I won't go through everything all over again, but I also do want to go back a little bit to remind ourselves about precious human rebirth, which we were talking about as well last week. And what I wanted to do, and I forgot, and I'll bring it back into, is to remember and to keep our recollection of the precious human rebirth, to recognize the value of being alive. This is worthwhile meditating on regularly, if not daily. And some people say it's a very good thing to do the first thing in the morning. And the benefits of this are primarily, as was stated, is because it starts us to recognize the value of each moment that we have, and to use it for a good purpose, for a reasonable purpose. One of the if you wanted to use a business sort of language, the KPI, a key performance indicator for this, or if you want an idea as to whether or not it's merely intellectual or it's becoming a part of who you are. There are ways in which we can measure success. So we don't need to just believe Ben or believe Buddha or believe Lama Tsongkhapa about this. We can actually find out for ourselves how good our understanding or our practice in precious human rebirth is. And as I said, there's nothing particularly necessarily religious about this. And we can find many people who have talked about, I think I alluded to Marcus Antonius before, about the idea of saying, carpe diem, seize the moment, make use of the time that we have. And one of the things that we can see is that there's, as we get to understand it and live it, one of the things we will notice is that we cease to be bored. Boredom really doesn't work once we understand this, because time is too precious for us to be bored. When we're waiting, if we're waiting for an appointment, or we're waiting in an airport, if we're sitting there with nothing to do, if we've really got this, if we understand it, we'll find something to fill our time. So we won't be sitting there just waiting or playing or idly doing nothing. We'll actually use that time available so we can see these things. Again, another example, which is it's much easier for us to engage in negative activity if we have if we haven't understood this. So for instance, we can very easily find ourselves talking with our work colleagues, criticizing the boss or another work colleague or whatever, sort of rather mindlessly, because we're not really engaged in understanding the preciousness of what we have. And one of the qualities of these is this sort of mindfulness and vigilance, the mindfulness of the preciousness of the moment, and a vigilance in terms of saying, I want to do the very best I can with this time. Now, how we use that, what we put it into, at this point, you know, it can be all sorts of things. It might be we want to become a better person in gymnastics or an Olympic runner or whatever. But at the same time, all of these people who are working on success have got this quality of mind. Not everybody, but in general, some people have natural skills. But in the end, what we're saying is the only time that I can actually really make most use of my time is through recognizing the preciousness of being alive. So there are some really positive benefits outside of a religious context or a spiritual context. So I'm going to slightly also deviate, going back to the three types of person. When I talk about religious, religion is a word that has many definitions, and what I'm trying to talk about here is that which is concerned with what happens after we die. So, and when we talk about secular, all I'm meaning that is those concerns which are not concerned with what happens after we die. So those thoughts which are concerned with what's happening in this lifetime. So many people struggle with anything happening after they die that involves their mind continuing after they die. And there is space for that within the Buddhist tradition. And I think this is what I was trying to get to, is that we still have plenty of secular spiritual activity, completely based on Buddha's teachings, which we should consider as being Buddhist. And training in them is absolutely fine. And likewise, mindfulness and vigilance, as I said, is not particularly anything to do with necessarily with future lives. It helps us in terms of developing ourselves in this life alone. So why I was making this point and got rather heated about it was really the idea of saying we don't want to think that if it doesn't involve future lives, it's somehow non-Buddhist. Whereas Lama Tsongkhapa, when he was writing this, he was primarily concerned with a culture where everybody believed in some form of continuity after death. So for him, he really saw the distinction of just thinking about this life as those people involved in normal worldly ambition, so which was known as the 8 worldly dharmas, such as being famous or rich or whatever. So these sorts of things, these sorts of minds which are distracted by apparent advantage but have no real advantage, these are the sorts of things that he didn't want us to be confused about. Hence why he made the decision not to include secular practice in when he was writing this. So he then says, well, I want to explain, we already covered in the early chapter the idea of saying that we need to train in the different scopes or the different levels or the different approaches to the path, different stages of the path, because we need to be able to teach as well from a Mahayana tradition, from the idea of being able to deliver teachings appropriate to the audience. We need to be able to know how to do that. But also, he wants to make the point that it's not just to do that; it's also to do the fact that our minds, and this is something Geshe made very clear again, which is not necessarily particularly clear in the text, but from the living tradition, definitely, and I hold his views very, very highly on this. He said, when our minds are not holding bodhicitta, this aspiration for enlightenment, then we are able to engage in bodhisattva activity. And when our mind is not in a state of renunciation or seeking nirvana beyond the cycle of samsara, then we're not able to practice those middle scope practices or the medium scope practices. And likewise, if we have some sort of inability or to recognize karma or consequences of our actions, especially in terms of our own future mindset, then even low scope teachings aren't really available to us. And this is because these three qualities of mind are required in order to reach or to engage in those practices. So although we talk about it in terms of motivation, whether or not I'm interested in high rebirth, or whether or not I'm interested in nirvana, or whether or not I'm interested in practices that are to do with Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings, of course, that view, holding that view and being able to hold that view, is an essential framework, foundational key required to be able to engage in those practices. Now, in fairness, of course, when we take a bodhisattva vow, especially as students, untrained students or new students like ourselves, then we have this High Lama helping us to develop this aspiration for enlightenment, and we sort of take the vow and we engage in the best we can. We engage in the keeping, sustaining the additional vows, root vows and secondary vows. And in one sense, because we've taken the vow and because we're able to refrain from breaking these vows, we're able to say, well, at that moment I entered into the Mahayana path, and therefore I can consider myself to be a Mahayana practitioner. But in terms of the type of person I am, and this is the point that Geshe made, that depends upon my current mental continuum right now. So not necessarily my karmic continuum, as in terms of whether or not I'm a Buddhist or a Mahayana Buddhist, but in terms of my actual state and ability to meditate, that depends on my current state right now. So in that sense, it sort of feels like impossible to do anything, but it's not really like that. A little bit later on, I'm sort of slightly jumping. There's a nice, oh no, it's actually it's not in this, it's in the three principal aspects of the path. There's a commentary to that, and in that, I think it's, I can't remember the author, but he said, you know, think far, think big, and pace yourself. And this was a sort of a summary, some mind training summary, and typically very, very pithy. Think big, think far means think about Buddhahood. So remember your focus. And I've said again and again, all of this text is really all about becoming Buddha. So think far, think big is take on what you can, you know, think, oh, I can do this. Be able to be brave in terms of saying, yeah, I can do this. I can meditate on compassion for all sentient beings. Rather than thinking, well, maybe I can't do it. It's always better to have courage but then also take steps, pace yourself. Is not just to rush in and then tire ourselves and feel unable to do anything, and then having to pick ourselves up and start all over again. But rather to take a pace that we can keep and sustain, however small that might be, because we can always then adjust ourselves accordingly. And we will need to, as our practice develops, we will be able to be more and more, to take more and more on. That doesn't necessarily mean more time on the cushion. What it means is ability to recognize and use more moments of our time, of our precious time, accordingly. So thinking big, thinking distant, and taking pace. It is a lovely way. It is out of the Lam Rim, but it's not in the Lam Rim, but it does remind us very much of what the Lam Rim is about. So then he says, and he wants to make this clear, and this is really why I was drawing pyramids and talking about pyramids, is that the stages of the person of a Mahayana practitioner, which is what we're aiming to be and trying to achieve, include the paths, and not only include, but include most of the practices of the other types of persons, the other categories. In other words, if we wish to develop bodhicitta, we also need to already have developed renunciation from samsara, and likewise we wish to avoid falling into a realm which will destroy our minds or prevent us from being able to practice. So in that sense, what we're wanting to do is to make sure that and recognize that the paths and the practices of the lower, of the higher, include the paths and the practices of the lower for ourselves, as well as in terms of teaching. He quotes Abhigosha, Lama Tsongkhapa quotes Abhigosha in terms of the ethical basis of these three types of person, in a sense, happy rebirth, nirvana, and Buddhahood. He says, being harmless, truthful, and chaste, not stealing, and being generous, these are the deeds that give rise to happy rebirth. Once we've seen the suffering of the cycle, of the samsara, we've cultivated the true path to abandon it, and is recognizing it, seeing it, we're able to then abandon it. We eliminate the two misdeeds, and then that gives us rise to peace. And then he says that a person of great capacity, Mahayana, practice all of these. They are the branches of the path and of the supreme determination to be free. And the knowledge that all phenomena are emptinesses creates the stream of compassion for all beings. So this last, I'm going to slightly jump into a little bit more detail. Avagosha was one of the primary lineage holders of the wisdom tradition stemming from Nagarjuna, Indian. And he's saying here, and it's absolutely relevant to us, that emptiness or wisdom, insight, and compassion are totally interlinked. So we imagine that they're not the same, that they look rather different to each other. But as we get more and more insight and more clarity, and as we develop our compassion, we begin to see that really they're two sides of the same coin. Now, it is said that when we're doing our practice as meditators and as practitioners, and are taking on our own personal practice, so remember the point here is that we are going to often have to be judges of ourselves in this. Sometimes it's easier we should consider playing to our strengths. One of the reasons for this is because it's easier for us to play to our strengths than it is to attack our weaknesses. It doesn't mean that we don't have to do anything about our weaknesses, but we can move from our strengths to help work on our weaknesses. If we do it the other way around, then we can often find ourselves feeling quite demoralized because we're not going to be able to see so much progress. On the other hand, some people do prefer the idea of saying, okay, I'm safe here, I want to work on what I'm not safe at. So this is a personal decision. And within that, we have this idea of saying that, especially within the Mahayana context, the idea of saying whether or not we can work from compassion, or whether or not we work from insight or from wisdom. And some people definitely find it easier to develop the compassion. And then as they develop the compassion, they realize the depth of that compassion, the root of that compassion, and that opens them up into insight. Other people find it the other way around. So from Avagosha's point of view, who is obviously from the wisdom lineage, and often in general, he suggests that one can find the root of compassion through insight, through wisdom. But it does go both ways. So Lama Tsongkhapa continues to say, therefore, even when our teachers are teaching us about what appears to be a low scope or foundation scope practice, they're not, or if they teach us middle scope practices, this doesn't mean that they're recognizing us as being somehow foundation scope practitioners or foundation scope in our mind. What they're saying is these are still reliable, recognizable, and necessary to our practice as Mahayana. And likewise, this is what the text is about. If, for instance, we imagine that the stages of the path, of the Mahayana path, didn't require us to train in the foundation middle scopes, then we wouldn't really find ourselves needing to go into so much detail in this case. We'd be looking much more at how best to present such paths to others. But here he's saying it's not enough. We actually need to find in our heart, we've got to find in our mind the ability to change ourselves to adopt this. So Baba Viveka, another lineage holder, he says, these bodies are insubstantial like banana trees and bubbles. Who would not give them substance by making them conditions for helping others? So he's saying here primarily, he's using the idea of saying, if we think about how unimportant our bodies are, they appear to us to be important, but really they're not so important and they're very fragile. Why on earth would we not use them if we can to become Buddhas? So he says this is the way in which we can enter the Mahayana with the thought, day and night I will conduct myself as a person of great capacity, able to benefit others, always thinking about achieving enlightenment in order to help all beings, making use of this body of mine, which otherwise is a home just for illness, a basis for the suffering of old age and the like, and which lacked any essence. So recognizing that all I actually can do is of any value is to work on the great project. Yeah, this is a way of doing that. So somebody asks, so as a Mahayana teacher, we should be guiding students throughout the practice of a Mahayana practitioner. What is the use of training these paths, the shad, with a foundation in the middle? And he says, these are shad, and it's a prerequisite, and he will explain further. So I've actually covered this briefly, but we'll go into his own sort of things. And he says why one guides students through the stages, if you like, rather than just as a toolbox. He says the entrance to Mahayana, the entrance, the key to being a Mahayana practitioner is one thing, and it is solely this one thing, which is the spirit of supreme enlightenment, otherwise known as bodhicitta. Once this is produced in your mind stream, then at that instant you are free from all sorts of negative consequences, and you become known as one of Buddha's children. He's citing Shantideva's Bodhicharipatara. And such people are then recognized or called bodhisattvas. And the meaning is clear. Bodhicitta is Sanskrit, but what we're saying is it's the mind of enlightenment. But it's not just I want to be enlightened. It's the basis of that motivation being wanting to meet the needs of all beings, right? So once I recognize the suffering of all beings, that gives me the opportunity to say, okay, I can see that the best way in which I can address that need is through being a Buddha. And so from that basis, I want to be, but it's no good just saying, oh, I want to be a Buddha, right? One has to actually build up this sense of compassion, this altruistic intention to become a Buddha, and then that itself becomes bodhicitta. Now, it's actually a bit more subtle than that. As we get to a little bit more experience, we see that really there's a specific type of compassion that's required, not just a general compassion. And the compassion is based on recognizing the suffering of being stuck in samsara. And in order to do that, we need to recognize the cause of samsara, which is ignorance. In order to do that, we have to recognize the mechanism by which ignorance and the wrong view keeps us in samsara. So you can see that quickly, actually, there is a degree of insight required for us to really pinpoint what this compassion is. And you can then see why this compassion is actually quite strongly linked with insight. It's not just mysterious sort of mystical stuff. It's primarily because then when we see in ourselves just how deeply rooted in wrong view and delusions we are, and we can see how this is preventing us the mechanism by which this is preventing us from being free from suffering, this overwhelming sense of compassion that we're all stuck in this complete bloody mess, overwhelms us, right? And then we're able to say, okay, yeah, this is something, this is no good. It's no good. There's got to be a way through this, and that's what I'm going to work on. So when we're able to do that, even if we can do it for a moment, we don't need to be in a formal situation. But once we get that, and we see just how that delusion is completely permeating us and preventing us from being able to get free, we can then extend that and recognize that in others. And it gives us this huge sense of empathic compassion that's very, very deep, very, very deep rooted. But we do need to understand really how that causes or prevents us from being liberated. And then that compassion, great compassion, it becomes the foundation for the motivation to be a Buddha. So initially, our compassion is less specific, but as we develop and as we get a clearer understanding, it becomes more and more engaged in the path. And then at that point, our bodhicitta becomes improved. So it doesn't mean that earlier bodhicitta is useless. It just means that it becomes strengthened, right? In one sense, you could argue that really, until you've actually, achieved some incredible realization, you're not really a bodhisattva. So lots of people are very reluctant to say, I'm a bodhisattva, especially as we're meant to be trying to keep this from moment to moment. So in those senses, definitely, it's what we aspire to, and we definitely want to do our best to reach through practice. But being an aspiring bodhisattva is still considered to be extremely valid and very, very useful in terms of practice. So we shouldn't be disheartened. So here it says the benefits, here he's talking about bodhicitta, bodhisattva. He says the benefits here of developing bodhicitta are twofold. One of them is temporary and one of them is final. And the temporary benefits are that we are free from no rebirth. We will be able to be reborn either as a god or in one of the desire realms, or as a human practitioner again. And secondly, so that's the twofold, is not being low rebirth and also being able to be born in a high rebirth as a practitioner. And what that means is it allows us to continue to accumulate. So I think I mentioned Sisyphus, right? The Greek myth of the guy pushing the boulder up the hill. So likewise, the chances are that we have all, at some time or another, have actually practiced in the past and have developed some degree of bodhicitta, which allows for us to share in, to listen, and to take part in the project. So we're continuing our journey. We're not just starting it. It might feel sometimes that we're just starting, but we're not. We're actually doing quite well already. So the idea is, let's continue, let's carry on doing this and remembering to bring back our bodhicitta, our bodhisattva nature, right? This is a really nice way of doing it, is this, otherwise it feels always we're right at the bottom of everything. It's like just a huge struggle. But actually we can tell by the fact that we're here, that we're able to listen, we're able to take part, and we're able to engage in a Dharma that we have actually done quite a lot of work already. So. And then the final, obviously he said that, and there's a final benefit, and this is essentially liberation from suffering, freedom from suffering permanently, and likewise omniscience. So the quality of Buddha, of being able to see everything without any lack of clarity. So there's some slight differences of opinion about what omniscience is, but my favorite one of the favorite teachings I had on it when I used to be younger. I was quite precocious. I used to ask questions when I really shouldn't have done. And so Lam would say, if there's anyone got any questions, and I'd say, so what is omniscience? Like this. It's like so really silly. And one of these lamas said, good question. Find out for yourself. so yeah, find out for yourself. And again, Je Rinpoche quotes from sites from Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, and he says, these beings have yet to dream of such an attitude towards even their own welfare. How could they begin to produce it for others? And he's saying, if I can't even recognize nirvana, how could I begin to recognize Buddhahood? So in that sense, we can see he's providing us with a very clear example of how we must train in and work on those aspects of the foundation and the middle scopes that are in accord with or conducive with the Mahayana practice. And again, I think there's also this point which was made right in chapter 1 or chapter 2, which was to do with saying, by recognizing these different motivations and these different practices as being valid practices, and like I was saying, also secular Buddhism as being valid, then we prevent ourselves from the great fault of trying to say that one's less, that one's high, that one's, and say that's no good or that's better. So these sorts of things are really dangerous. I mean, honestly, it's very easy, especially when we see things like low, middle, high, and I sort of slightly have a tendency to struggle with that, but because it sort of implies that one's less important. But actually, what's important is doing the right meditation at the right moment. We get one chance for each moment. We need to find the right meditation for this moment. And again, going back to the book 3, right at the end. He says, as Je Rinpoche says, I'll find it. We'll do that later, I think, that bit. So when it seems maybe your faith in the teacher, and either your teacher or also Buddha or Tsong-kha-pa, who the instructions on the path, if that's decreasing, then you should work. That will cut the root of everything. In other words, essentially, if you begin to lose faith in the path, then the whole path begins to crumble. So therefore, work on developing strength in your faith in the path, recognizing its truth. Okay, so again, we're getting away from intellectual. We're trying to recognize in ourselves how valid this is. And if we don't find it valid, it's best to put that to one side and choose the teaching that we do find valid. And there are some things which is very hard for us to ever refute, like preciousness of our life, or the fact that we're going to die. So these ones are always, if you like, safe bases for us, even if we're in very distressed places or confused places. And then he says, if you're, and this is relevant, he says, if your joy in your practice loses strength, make meditation on the topics connected with your precious life the subject of your meditation. So this is after everything. This is after this entire text is the last 2 of the 6 perfections, right? So he's saying, after all of this discussion, he's saying in the end, yeah, we still need these practices. This is the toolbox nature of the Lam Rim, right? So by recognizing, okay, particular conditions, then these are the great remedies from Lam Rim. And so on. I mean, we haven't covered many of these areas yet, but for instance, if your attachment to this life increases, who get too involved in the activities of this life, then making meditation on impermanence your focus. So we'll go into more of that as we cover it, I think. So we can see that both in terms of gradual training, developing ourselves, but also in terms of the toolbox, we've got these meditations remain valuable and valid to us. They become contextually appropriate. So then to say this is less or this is great, it's making a mistake, because it implies that if my mind is getting caught up in something quite generic, such as I'm losing interest in everything in my practice, then really practicing rebirth is a good place to start, rather than trying to carry on with a deep meditation on compassion or whatever. Sometimes compassion works, but that's a different case. So. So there's a big chunk of text here. I'm wondering whether or not to go into all the detail of it here. So he's saying, being able to train in and develop and take time to actually consider our practicing rebirth, get experience with it. So we did how to meditation session, how to focus on these things. And one of the opportunities of listening to Lam Rim teachings, like we are, or teaching or trying to teach, is that we can use this as an opportunity to stage out some of these practices. So it is, he says, it's a really, really good idea for us to get a familiarity with meditating on these topics. So likewise, so being able to meditate until we can actually find a life in terms of a change in our mind, or being able to see a change in our mind from considering our precious human rebirth, and later on the other practices, or recognizing the quality of the teaching, for instance. These things, and doing one in a session, not mixing and maxing or just letting ourselves go wherever you want, these things are extremely useful in actually seeing our mind change. So again, we've got to recognize that our minds are polluted by these wrong views, and the way in which we're able to practice and the way in which we're able to deal with our practice are linked to those wrong views. The wrong views drive us in terms of how we see the world and how therefore we respond to the world. And so by being able, and ourselves, how we see ourselves and how we imagine ourselves to be responding to the world, often we're like in a dream. We're only sort of half aware of half what's going on around us. So the idea is to try to bring up some more clarity in this, and to be more mindful and more aware, and to begin to take down some of the delusion, become more outward looking, if you like, more able to deal with the moment. So he says then, once we've been able to train in this, then in these the foundation, the low and the middle scopes, or these things, so we've got some strong idea about the importance of high rebirth, but also of liberation. Once we're able to feel confident in our disinterest in or a lack of attraction to this life, but also into samsara, then this is a really good idea to start developing our spirit of enlightenment properly, formally. And then we stabilize that with refuge. And then we can, he says, if we haven't done that, then to take the vow again, or to a vow of a bodhisattva. And then developing the strong yearning to train in the bodhisattva deeds, the 6 perfections and so on. And when this comes from the depth of your heart, then we again take the vow of enlightenment. And then try not to be, we work hard not to allow the root infractions of the bodhisattva vow to be broken. He says, even at the risk of your life. And then also to be mindful of the small and middle inflections, or by creation of other thoughts from other parts of the path. And then he says, then we can train broadly in the six perfections, particularly in meditative stabilization, and developing this incredible serenity. And this gives us a very, very flexible, powerful mind that we can use. We can easily focus on something and sustain our focus without any distraction for 4 hours is normally the criteria. And then within that, we can use that, having also learned enough about insight, selflessness, anatman. And when we then are able to sustain an unmistaken meditation session on anatman, there is a moment in that point of time when we, it's called sometimes like the meeting of the mother and the son, where there is a direct perception of selflessness, and this is the path of Enlightenment. This is when we become an Arya being, a noble being. At which point, for many, in many ways, we're enlightened. But there's still a long way to go. But it's a different part of the path. If we're able to get that, then we're doing very, very well indeed. So he says, this whole practice is how we can actually achieve and spread the two wings. The one is the conventional truths, or the methods of the path, and the other wing, which depends upon ultimate truths, is to recognize the reality of selflessness. However, to just take up on one path of our bodies, like say, our compassion without the insight, or the insight without the compassion, is a bit like flying like a bird with a broken wing, right? So the idea is we want to have both of these in order to be able to fly as a royal geese, one of the conqueror's children, right? And here's taken from Chandrakirti's commentary on the Middle Way. Spreading the broad white wings of reality and conventionality, the royal geese, escorted by the flock of living beings, fly on the winds of virtue to supremacy on the far shore of a Buddha's ocean-like qualities. So it's beautiful, right? So this is really very much what we're trying to do. He then says, once we've done all of this, okay, we haven't finished yet. So once we've done all of this, then once we've trained our mind enough, not necessarily reached the Arya state, right? But when we've got our good training base, then we should definitely enter the mantra path, because when we do so, we can quickly complete the collections of merit and purification. He says, maybe you do not want to do that because you don't have an inclination due to former lives. Then just carry on improving the stages of the path until you're actually able to achieve enlightenment. So he says here, essentially, he mentions mantra path or tantra. This is one of the ways in which this works primarily isn't sort of it. We said before weeks ago, this isn't about sex. What he's talking about is methodologies of being able to use this very, very well trained mind to speed up the process of a bodhisattva. So a bodhisattva normally, from the moment of engaging in the path, this is recognizing correct bodhicitta, the higher bodhicitta. The bodhisattva path takes 3 ages of a universe to complete, 3 universals. So we're currently, I think scientists say we've done 14,000 million years of this one. We've got at least another 28,000 million years to go before this universe finishes. So we need to carry on working on this one, and then another 2 universes, and then we can become Buddha, right? So it's quite a long time in terms of I know this has probably got to cause more questions than answers, but as I said, really the idea is not to get too caught up in the intellectual side of this, as I'm trying to think about it in terms of the practice. Uh, um, but yes, we can argue that there's not any state of a state for the in the early universe or the late universe for a human being to be present. That's correct, but mind can our karma allows our mind to rest until there's a body available to us. So there's some of that time is waiting, just for the universe to sort itself out or end. So in that sense, okay. So then what we're looking at is, and so this is in a sense why one talks about Tantra, because within the Tantra or mantra tradition, using these particular techniques, one is able to change that from three ages, three universal ages, to as little as 15 lifetimes. Now, which is a blink of the eye in comparison. There are some tantras that say 3 years. Yep, you can do the whole, but you can become a Buddha in 3 years. And I have it on good authority. This is His Holiness Dalai Lama said, I think this is sales pitch, to be honest with you. It's very hard to imagine how we could do that unless we're already so far up the path that it doesn't really matter. So because there's quite a lot of training involved in terms of even getting through to the generation stage practice. So first of all, we're working on a generation stage is a tantric practice, and this is where we're really working on taking every opportunity, every moment of our life, both awake and sleep, and recognizing the truth of the Dharma of everything around us. So in this way, we actually, if you think about it this way, I mean, it was not really a teaching on Tantra, but what we're doing here is to say, one way of looking at the world around us is that everything is a part of suffering and misery and samsara, right? And that's exactly correct. There's no denying that. From a Buddhist context, everything is suffering, impermanent, and empty. So that's correct. But the other way of looking at this is to say, therefore, everything provides us. Everything is a Dharma. Everything provides us with the truth of that. When we can recognize the truth of the suffering, impermanence, and emptiness of everything around us, then we can see it as being Dharma, pure Dharma. And in that sense, everything becomes a sphere. Our experience becomes a sphere of Dharma and pure Dharma. So this way, we're able to recognize everything as being instruction on everything, every single moment of thought, every single moment of emotion, everything we engaged in, as being pure, unsullied Dharma, right? Pure Dharma from Buddha. So essentially, the primary jump between a Mahayana practice and a Sutra practice is very small. It's a very, very subtle one. And Tantra practice rather. So within that distinction is then the ability for us to engage and be mindful of the Dharma nature of the universe, and as such, we're able to start developing a mindfulness of sustaining that point of view. So the energy becomes the point about this is that we're able to then use that perspective as a way of being able to leverage a continual practice. Okay, maybe it's too much, but that's some sort of idea about how one goes about practicing Dharma. When one is able to, this provides a huge opportunity for developing a very, very powerful focus, much more powerful than a normal meditation practice. And with that, then what we do is we use that. So there's a point where we can visualize, because we're working on choosing points of view, perspectives, and metaphor, and being able to, therefore, we get very good at visualization. So when we're able to, I think, visualize something like 64,000 different objects simultaneously and uniquely without any blurring or indistinction or yes, them over there. So we can see each one perfectly and sustain that. I think it's for either 4 or 6 hours. Then we're ready for completion stage practice. Okay, so a completion stage practice, what we then do is use that focus, that very powerful focus, along with this extremely strong realization of Dharma, of truth, to focus on certain parts of our body, to bring subtler levels of consciousness, and the subtle levels of consciousness we're able to then exploit to speed up the process of the meditation. So we need to have full mental control before we can even go there. Even if we have a slight disturbance of mind, this can have very strong ramifications. And this is why often these practices are called secret, because you need to have this qualified mind before you can attempt these practices. Otherwise, it's I remember some Lama saying it's a bit like otherwise you're swallowing a hand grenade, and it's generally not a good idea. So within that, then what we can do, so for instance, sleep yoga, where we bring our mind meditation into our dream state. Somebody says that it speeds up the process of meditation 1,000-fold, something like that. So it's not like we're just doing inception where we're sort of looking at beaches and stuff. What we're doing is we're using this time to develop a meditative awareness of emptiness, of pure truth, and sustaining that while being asleep, which is not easy. If you've ever tried to even get home when you're asleep, it's quite hard in your dreams. So yeah, it's quite a challenge. Anyway, so this is why he's talking about using Tantra, a mantra in these ways. So he also says, quoting both Atisha and somebody else, how when we begin to recognize the quality of enlightenment and the suffering of samsara, then there's this transvaluation where we begin to change our behavior from those who are untrained in the spiritual practice, because we recognize or see the flaws in terms of what a worldly or a non-spiritual practice have. And so we see a begin of, we see a sort of, if you like, some of the qualities such as not being interested in wealth, not being interested in fame, not being interested in it so much in the opinions of others, and becoming much more stronger in ourselves. So these sorts of things generally are, yeah, obviously having some, being free from poverty is important. In fact, this is, if you like, one of the qualities of a precious human rebirth. But but actually seeing wealth or fine dining, if you like, as some sort of experience that makes our life more meaningful, not so much. I think there's also sort of things like bucket list. If we understand, once we've developed a strong understanding of the value of our lives and also the shortness of our lives and what really makes a difference, that we find a sense of fulfillment that sort of means a bucket list doesn't really make any sense to us anymore. Whether or not I've been to Machu Picchu or to the pyramids, in the end, what I'm going to be left with is a memory, right? So it's not as if it's a huge of any value to the universe as to whether or not I've been to Machu Picchu, right? So in that sense, sometimes these things are good. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying that what we'll see is a less interest in these sorts of things, right? So So then somebody asks the question, and then we will be done for the 3 types of person. He says, why use expression stage of the path shared with the persons of small and medium capacity, or the foundation and medium capacity? So there's some really important points here. One of them is it destroys this presumption of assuming that being a person of great capacity, of thinking that you can be a person of great capacity if you haven't actually developed the states of a person of foundation or middle capacity. And secondly, which is what I had mentioned earlier, is the ability to teach them. And recognizing that being able to teach people who actually are limited in terms of their ability to develop any further as people, then to say, well, if they need to be taught in the context of merely high rebirth or in terms of liberation, rather than that of bodhisattvahood, Buddhahood, then we do need to have a familiarity and facility to be able to do that. And he says the thing to remember, and this is also true of us, is that when our minds aren't strong in terms of recognizing the Four Noble Truths and bodhicitta, training in these high practices will be less powerful for us than if we're able to train in those skills that are actually in tune with and concordant with our current mind. So he said, is completely relevant for us to continue to aspire towards and work with the idea of developing a Mahayana view. We also have to recognize that we do need to have some experience with these basic these foundation practices, really. And he says it's actually often a much more benefit to work on what you need to work on right now, rather than to try to do something high and complex when really you haven't established the foundation. And it's up to us, as I said, in the end, what we really want to do is to make a difference. So we're looking for any edge, any edge whatsoever. Sometimes it's like, okay, I've got, I can't just do more death awareness or whatever. So fine, but also to recognize, well, maybe there's something else. This is about something else too. Yeah. So joy, right? We're trying to find joy. Precious human rebirth gives us a lot of joy. Again, we might find too much joy, and then it happens, And then in that sense, we because if we're too high, then we come down. So we need to have this. Remember these things. Set a pace, right? So we're trying to do this small, safe steps. This is something many of my friends have heard me say again and again. Whenever you're making a decision or you're changing your life, small, safe steps are strong. Set a pace. Stick to it. No dramatic changes. And it says, the method by which beings who are beginners engage in the ultimate purpose to become a Buddha was said to be like steps on a staircase, small, safe steps. So, right, exactly what I was saying. There it is written. It's nice when that happens. Okay. So now there's a mindfulness of death. This is very powerful stuff. Primarily, this is the contemplation that we are not going to remain long on the world. And J. Rinpoche has divided this into 4 sections: the fault of not cultivating mindfulness of death, the benefits of cultivating a mindfulness of death, the kind of mindfulness, what we're trying to seek in terms of what that means and what it looks like in terms of our development, and then how to do it. So the 4 main errors involved in impeding us taking advantage of our life, our precious human life, are the four well-established aspects of Buddhism in terms of mistaken view. Okay, right back to week one, I said in the end, our delusions are what prevents us from being able to find this practice easy. One, conceiving the impure to be pure, conceiving suffering to be happiness, conceiving the impermanent to be permanent, and considering the selfless to have a self. So these are, you find this in the Pali tradition, you find it everywhere. There's sort of the one of the great Buddhist sort of central theses. And he says, of these four, the perception of the impermanent to be permanent is the avenue of a huge amount of misery. And within this, there are two. So the two are coarse impermanence and subtle impermanence. And coarse impermanence is death awareness. It's actually one's own death, one's own mortality. This is the idea of coarse impermanence. In fact, it's a bit more than that. But in the case of this, he's talking primarily about the mindfulness via death. Mindfulness via death is the largest of the course, or probably the most easy to connect with in terms of coarse impermanence. But there are lots of these as well. So, for instance, imagining that my partner is always going to be with me, or imagining that my mother is always going to be around, or imagining that I'm always going to have this job. All of these sorts of things are coarse impermanence, right? They're an expectation that is quite obviously flawed, right? And we can recognize our attachment, even though we know intellectually that this is a flawed view. We can recognize our attachment when it goes as this sort of sense of complete outrage. And we see it as children. If a child has something and they believe they're going to have it for as long as they want it, and it goes, or it melts, like ice cream melts. It's like, where's my ice cream gone? I'm furious. I've lost my ice cream. It's just turned into gooey mess down my arm. And I've seen, like, my little sisters just completely devastated by the impermanence of the ice cream, right? So it's not like it's just our death. It's this idea, this expectation that we buy into, that somehow, things aren't going to change, status quo, right? Things are just going to stay the way they're going. And whenever our expectation of that goes, there's this sense of injustice, or this sense of loss, or this breakdown of expectation, which we often externalize. So it's much easier for us to sort of blame the outside world rather than to recognize this. Our view is mistaken. Why did we imagine anything else? And there's often two ways this goes. One is this fury at somebody random, or whoever it is that we recognize as being the perpetrator of this. So for my sisters, I seem to remember it was Mum. It was Mum's fault that their ice cream melted somehow. But on that sense also, I only remember I was the eldest, so it was harder for me to recognize my own exactly the same sort of response, but I saw it in my little sisters. So it's nothing that is unique to them or anything like that. I just want to get it clear. So this expectation of somehow of continuity, it is as true in so many things in our lives. Crazy things. I mean, for instance, if you imagine you had you were, I don't know, deeply keen on Game of Thrones or whatever, and then or some other series, and then on the last series there's another series due, and then they say we've pulled the plug, we're not going to go there anymore. It's like, what? How can they do that? It's like, it really doesn't matter. But the sense of fury is like, it can be very strong. You see it on the internet. Oh, it's outrageous what they did. You know, sort of like, okay, so we can recognize it. Yeah, it's not hard to see. So this idea of attachment to the impermanence as being permanent is something he's talking about specifically here. Now, subtle impermanence is the fact that everything finishes. There's nothing that is going to stay. Everything is continually changing. And as it happens, although this was written, these ideas were talked about by Buddha 2,500 years ago, and some of the things he's talked about are possibly questionable. Certainly when it comes to subtle impermanence, not so. Physicists absolutely agree with this. There is nothing that remains. Everything is in a state of motion. Heat is caused by the motion of particles. And as everything is motion, nothing remains. So when we recognize this, we begin to let go of some of that attachment. And that's why often actually many people, when they're teaching insight, when they're teaching enlightenment, emptiness, what they're really describing is subtle impermanence. Because it does help us let go of this strong idea of a sense of permanent, unchanging self. So there's a strong relationship between, in terms of the effect of impermanence, subtle impermanence, and emptiness. But in the end, they are actually distinct. But what we're talking about now is coarse emptiness, coarse impermanence. Goodness me. I'll find my place. Here we go. So he says, if we look at ourselves and we look at the idea of the thought, I will not die, it sounds wrong, even to us. Intellectually, we totally understand it sounds wrong. It's sort of a ludicrous thing for anybody to say meaningfully, certainly over the age of 6 or so. And Lam Rim recognizes that, and he says everybody has the idea that death will come later in the end. But what we find is actually, if we look closely, most of us have in our normal life have this idea that I'm not going to die today, that it's going to happen sometime in the future. And this remains the case until we are told by the doctor or till we recognize in ourselves that that's just not true anymore. And it's at that moment there that we can develop some sort of understanding of death awareness. But if we don't have much training in it, then it often leads to negative responses, negative emotions. So what we see is this idea that we know from experience, we absolutely know, we can look around us, we only have to look at the news or we have to look at the statistics to see that, in fact, every day people of all ages are dying from car accidents, from random events, from all sorts, from a war, all sorts of things. People die, you can't really tell. And yet we still have this idea, not me. You know, this is really common also with victims of crime, is they all say, everybody says, you know, I thought it would happen to somebody else, or I knew it happened, but I never thought it would happen to me. So this sort of sense of we have this idea of a personal bubble of immortality and invincibility. And he says, while we have this attitude, we think really primarily about this life. So we think about what we need to do, what our responsibilities have us to do, what things we need to buy from Amazon, what things we need to get rid of maybe, how much more ironing we have to do, all of these sorts of things, right? So there's a continual list. We all I'm sure all of us are carrying around some variant of either rather scatological, broken up, not scatological, sort of scattered, sorry, excuse me, a scattered list of random things that pop into our head. Some of us might have a more organized list. Some might actually have a written list of, oh, I've got to get this done, I've got to get that done, and so on, right? This sort of mentality is a completely normal. And one of the things is that often fills our life to the point until we find out we have none left. And therefore, he's saying one of the problems is if we look at that list and say, well, how much of that is actually thinking about the long term, the distant path, right? Thinking big. How much of that time, how many of those things are really only concerned with what needs to be done in my current existence, this life, for this life purpose? Yeah. And not all of it, not all of it. Some of it where we're working to help promote organizations, or we're working to help children, or we're doing other things that are really positive, beneficial work. This has an extension beyond ourselves, beyond our lives. But at the same time, we also say, okay, well, there's this, that, and the other, which isn't so much, right? So in these sorts of senses, what we want to do is to try to find, and he says, try and find a gap, try to open up a gap that allows for us to consider putting in some spiritual practice into our routine. And he says, really, you need to look at that quite closely, our list. We need to look at our list quite closely and see, where do future lives appear on it? Where does liberation from samsara appear on it? Where does omniscience and Buddhahood appear on it? Yeah. So we want to be practitioners, and we need to think a little bit of saying, okay, well, what does that really look like? Yeah. How does that look? What do we really have? So again, he says, if we don't even consider these things and refresh our thoughts on this, then we get overtaken by the things on our list to the point where we find ourselves actually doing non-virtuous activities like cheating or lying or stealing, maybe in small ways, or criticizing, or being snidey when we didn't really need to be snidey, or doing these things that are like, the equivalent of shoving dust under the carpet. It's really not ideal. It's not done with craftsmanship. It's not done with the skill and care that you could otherwise give it. So these things, and he says essentially we can very, very quickly, and then even that is the things that we need to do. We often find ourselves procrastinating with those, even though they're things that we don't necessarily really need to do. And this is really important with our practice. I'll do it eventually, I'll do it one day, I'll do it sometime. And in the end, actually, our sleep, senseless talk, our eating and drinking, our list of things that we need to do, our work and so on, just take up all our time. Our senses are responsibility for our families and our friends, which we should have some. Yeah, I'm not saying it's not there. What I'm saying is that obviously we need to make sure there's space for practice. And he says this often what we think is, okay, well, look, I'm young, I'm reasonably young, or even, this thing. I think some of us definitely have this experience now of like saying, when we're young, when we're like children, we look at an 18-year-old and say that's a man or that's a woman, right? And then when we're 18, we're like, well, I'm not a man, I'm still a child, and there's a 25-year-old, they're a man, they're a woman. When I'm 25, I'm still really feeling like a teenager. I'm not really sure I'm ready to take on such responsibility. And then okay, well, maybe I'm a sort of a man right now, or a woman right now. And then but I'm young. And then when I'm 35, or so, and you'll think, oh yeah, okay, well, I'm 25, so yeah, 40. When I'm 40, then I'll be middle-aged, right? We get to 40, we're like, I'm not middle-aged. Middle-aged people are 50 or 60, and when we get to 50, we're like, what? You can't call me middle-aged yet. I'm not middle-aged yet. And then when we're 60 or 70, then it's like, no, I'm not elderly. I'm certainly not elderly. And then when we're 80 or 90, we're like too old to do anything at all. So, but I'm sure that when I'm 90, I'll be exactly the same. I'm like, there are people older than me. So he says, this idea that we've got this hope, this seduction, that our body and our life will last a long time. And this would create, because we're thinking, I'm going to be here a long, long time, I don't need to worry about any of this, we develop this strong attachment to goods and services and things and my job, my career, and so on. This really fills up our time, right? And this itself then leaves, because we have an attachment to this, we had to develop a hostility to those people or those events which prevent us or impede us on our particular convictions. And of course, once we're stuck with fear and hostility, what Yoda says, it leads down towards the dark path, and we find ourselves doing things that we wouldn't otherwise do, saying things we really know we shouldn't, and actually possibly even beginning to do things such as developing negative actions, strong negative actions. He says even when things go right, let's say we do get the job, we do get the promotion, then there's a tendency to get proud. Or if we don't get it and even our best friend gets it, then there's some sort of degree of jealousy or fury. It's like, how comes you got it? What was wrong with me? And poor mum gets to hear all this stuff about what, it's just ridiculous. I've been working next to Alicia. She's only been doing the job for 2 years. She got the job. I got nothing. It's just ridiculous. I know much better. And so what's all of this about, right? What is it about? So this is a broken mind. This mind is broken by our convictions that these things are important, right? Based on the fact that we're not able to recognize that they don't really make that much difference in terms of our practice. We be responsible when we're doing our best in our career and in terms of our families and our relationships. We're all lay people. None of us here are monks or nuns. When we're doing our daily work and our daily commitments to our family, to our friends, to our house, to our work, we do our best to be responsible. We do our best to show craftsmanship. We don't cut corners. Whatever else happens doesn't matter. Okay, if the job goes, somebody else gets it, doesn't matter. We do our best. If somebody gets a job that we're trying to get, good for them, fantastic. Team effort, right? Thinking that way prevents us from falling down into a slippery slope of misery. Yeah. So trying to find a way, a perspective that keeps our mind stable, keeps our mind positive, is far more important than getting the job. Far more important. So in that sense, we want to say what really matters is having to keep and maintaining this positive outlook, positive mind, Dharma, recognizing Dharma. Even if we're not doing tantric practice, to recognize the Dharma of the situation. Yeah. Of course, people who are not qualified are going to get positions that we should get or whatever. It happens all the time. Why should we expect anything else? I deserve to win the lottery, God damn it, or whatever. It doesn't matter. What much more important is to sustain that mind, happiness. Contentment, right, is the basis of meditative strength. So once we've developed contentment, which buys into recognizing or having a slightly different, less attached grasp to sort of worldly goods and services, being content with what we have, where we're not sort of particularly worried, where we recognize each moment as being valuable and using it as much as we possibly can. The values to that are incredible. First of all, our mind is much easier to work with in terms of our training, developing our training. And secondly, we're just free from a whole raft of trouble. Anyway, So he says there's a basis of this primarily. One of the primary bases for going off and missing out is because we are not recollecting death. By recollecting death, we're able to keep things in perspective, that really, on my deathbed, did it matter that I got this or didn't get that, right? So does it really matter? And here he quotes Ayadeva's 400 verses, one of the many texts that is used again and again. He says, "What could be more dangerous than to sleep as though at ease, while subject to the Lord of Death, ruler of the three worlds, himself without a master?" And what Ayadeva is saying here is, we can carry on pretending that we're not, that there's nothing going on, but death is right here, right next to us, and there is no getting around it. And then Shantideva, he quotes Shantideva saying, "I will have to depart, leaving everything and everyone close to me, but not recognizing that, I commit various sins for the sake of my friends and foes." So this is like what we're saying about, we find ourselves falling into all sorts of messes because we're not really recognizing this fact. So primarily that was to do with the mindfulness, the drawbacks of not recollecting death. There's later on, I'm going to stop now because it's time, but later on there's a beautiful verse which I want to share. I can't find the verse, but the idea, the metaphor is to say, if we are falling, if we climb to the top of a tall building, and like the Shard or some huge tall building, and then we fall off it, our mind is not going to be very comfortable in that journey, right? It's not going to be comfortable at all. It's not going to last very long, but it's not going to be comfortable. So why is it that we're quite comfortable now? Because we are actually falling. Yeah. And it's that sort of thing of saying, it's because we're falling slowly, or because we're falling and we're not aware of it, that we continue to engage in practices or activities which really just of no benefit. Yeah. So these are the two, again, precious human rebirth and death awareness have this brilliant way of bringing us up and bringing us down when we're looking at mood adjustment. We don't want to feel if we're feeling too high, then it's really good to think about death awareness to bring our focus back on this truth. If we're feeling too low, then we can think about how precious our moments are. Every moment, even if we have very few moments left, each moment is still precious, still available to us, still we can use, right? So there's two beautiful meditations counterbalance each other and help us develop a more control, more ability to meet every day. And both of them helped us to engage in thinking about doing what's meaningful, right? So we're sustaining and developing our meaningful activity. Wonderful, absolutely powerful, wonderful practices. And of course, death and death awareness is known across the world as being one of the great meditations of Buddhism. But it's found elsewhere. You find it in Christian and Islam and elsewhere too. Okay, so dedication. Any benefits at all from taking part in today's session, listening or to teaching or meditating? I really want to put this towards substantially helping me shift and improve my mind and yours, our mind, to engage in practice more often, to recognize the benefits of the Dharma in our lives, to learn to become better people, to work on and continue to work on recognizing the Four Noble Truths and samsara, working hard on to also and valuing the importance of bodhicitta and developing bodhicitta such that we can safely remain on the Mahayana path to Buddhahood and thereby benefit all beings. Okay, that's what I want to dedicate any benefits today to. Okay, so let's finish on a couple of minutes of meditation. Again, I mean, any topic, if you find your mind's distracted, then breath awareness is fantastic. If you are interested in concentrating on making use of the different tools of Lam Rim, then that's useful, or on precious human rebirth, if you're feeling down a bit after the death awareness, or if you're feeling too high, then maybe on death awareness itself.